I also wanted to talk a bit about conditionals such as while loops, which is going to run a conditional, or excuse me, it's going to do something while something is true. To create a while loop first, what I'm going to do is type out the word while, pretty straightforward. And after my while loop, I'm going to put in two parentheses and then an open parenthesis bracket. Now, what this does is the while loop is here, and this inside of here is the condition that needs to be ran. So if I go ahead and I'm going to print out inside of my while loop running while, and what I want to do next is go ahead and type out something that should be true. Let's just try to say bool 2. So bool 2 we say up here is false, and what is going to happen is going to say while false, print out something. And we'll notice here that the while loop never runs because it's false. Now what happens if I go ahead and change this bool 2 to bool 1? We'll see here that I get a kind of a tweaked out console down here, and I don't want to break my computer, so I'm going to stop it really quick. But we'll see that because this is always true, it's going to get an infinite while loop. And you might have hit those before in your previous coding experiences, but essentially we want to avoid this. So these Boolean values don't really do us justice to what we can actually do with a powerful while loop. So what I want to do is go ahead and declare a number, and let's set it to 0. And what I want to do is say while num is less than or equal to 10, I'm going to print out my running, or I'm going to print out num itself. So now my num is less than or equal to 10, and I'm going to print it out. So if I hit run again, we'll notice that I get that same issue with my loop infinitely running. So how do I actually solve this? Well, what I need to do is try to somehow reach that conditional statement, right? I need to somehow reach a condition where I can break out of that while loop. And the way that I can do that here is I'm just going to say num is equal to num plus 1. So I'm just going to increment num by 1 each time. Now we'll see here, I get 0 up to 10, and I essentially count 10 times. If I do this 0 while num is less than 10, we'll see that I actually break out of that while loop. And to really show you the difference here, I'll just say out here, and while, we'll see that I have my 9, and if I set this to be equal to it, my while loop will run 10 times in an end. Now a little trick that we can add in here too is instead of doing the num is equal to num plus 1, we can do a num plus equals 1. And this is a really neat way of being able to do the exact same thing where you just add up 1 to your number each time. If you want to do it the other way, minus equals, that will go down the way, but that will cause us to have an infinite loop. Now, in the files provided for you for this week's material, supplemental material, there's lots of information here. You can look at the different while loops that we see that you can access as well. And what I would like to do is one of the files is the userandom.java file. And in the notes, if you read them, it says that we can rewrite this together. And I want to try to do that during this video now. We could see here that we get the 5 random numbers in these ranges in this system print line. What we could do here is let's go ahead and pick the last one here. And I just want to show off how we can actually convert this into a while loop. So I get 5 pseudo-random integers in this section here. And what we can do here is essentially comment out this guy here so that the code doesn't run. And what I would like to do is go ahead and make a new variable called maybe count, maybe set it to 0. And so what I want this to do is my while loop is supposed to run 5 times. So what I would like it to do is starting at 0 and going up until 5, it should do my mathematical randomness here. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab one of these print statements and put it into my while loop here. And if I run it here, we'll notice I'll get that infinite loop again. So the only other thing that I would need to fix here is to actually increment my count so that I can eventually break out of this while loop variable. Excuse me, the while loop. So I can do my plus equals 1, but I can also do my count is equal to count plus 1. Either way is fine. And if I run this now, we'll see that I get my 5 pseudo-random numbers in the same way, right? And you'll see here, this is where while loops and these ideas of logic get a lot handier, right? We did have to introduce a new variable, like an int count one. But that's fine. It's not a huge deal, and it actually saves quite a bit of space of code. You know, like if you look at this, you can get a bit cross-eyed, especially if you have 20 of them. And so we can actually go ahead and just increase this a lot easier to maybe be 20. So roll my dice 20 times. This is it. I just need to change this variable here. Roll my dice 10 times. Now I have 10 different rolls of my die. More advanced with our code, we're more than likely going to encounter situations where if statements and other types of statements are going to be crucial for our code to continue. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and declare a number like 15. And essentially an if statement is going to be very similar in layout to a while loop. So instead of starting with a while, we're going to be starting with surprisingly an if. And inside of that if, or after that if, we're going to put in 2 parentheses and then a bracket. Inside of these parentheses is going to be the conditional that needs to be ran. So again, what we could say here is if num is equal to 15, then I can do something, right? Oh, num1, excuse me. Then I'm going to enter into this conditional statement here. And what I can do is I can say something like this ran. And if I run this, we'll see I got the this ran. So now what happens if I hit 13? Well, nothing happens, right? Because I didn't hit that conditional statement. So what's the other one that we remember from an if? Is that else, right? Else, I could say the else ran. Cool. So now we can see that the else is running, and now we can also go ahead and try to put in one more conditional here with an else if. And inside of this else if, we can go ahead and say, okay, well, if this top one didn't run and the else isn't going to, or excuse me, if this top one didn't run, then we need to check if the else if is going to run. So if I'm going to say, if it's 13, I can say else if ran. Cool. So now if I run this one there, and just as a proof of concept, I'm going to change my num1 to be 15. So the top one ran, this ran. I'm going to change it to 13. So the else if ran. I'm going to change it to 11. The else ran. So this is essentially our branching statements with if and else. And we can also go ahead and try to make these nested inside of each other. And this is where it can get a bit convoluted as well, but there are very interesting ways to do it as well, right? So again, what we could do here, let's try to see if we can do this properly. We do a num2, and let's just put this to, let's just say it's 0. What I could say here is if num1 is equal to 15, and then I could say if num2 is equal to 0, I could then say system.out.println the nested if statement ran. And essentially what is going to happen is if this runs and this runs, then this action is going to occur. So if I go ahead and hit play here, I can see that the else ran. That's because I didn't change this to 15. So if I change this guy to 15, and then I change, and I try to run it here, we'll see that not only does the this run down here, because the it's underneath this if, but also this if statement up here ran. So the nested if. Now what happens if I change this to a 1? This ran. Now this can get actually pretty intense, right? So let me try to make one more here. And again, you don't need to follow this directly to a T. This is just, again, some more examples for you to help with your understanding. So if all 3 of these are true, we can see that the nested if ran. So you can really go and get nested into these here. Cool. I want to show you a pretty rudimentary example, which is where we were just going to iterate through a list of numbers and then print out if they're even or odd based on it. So what I can say here is I'm going to declare a counter variable, and I'm going to set it to 0. And then I'm going to say, while count is less than 20. So I want count to run 20 times. And what I'm going to say here is if count, and now this is a trick that some of us may or may not be familiar with, but essentially in computer science, if you mod something by 2, and that modulus operation is equal to 0, so I'm doing a few things here. I'm modding my count variable by 2, and if I get no remainder, if the remainder is 0, that means that I'm on an that means that I'm on an even number. Now, what I could say here, else if count mod 2 is equal to 1, that tells us that we're actually on an odd number. And now let's just say that something crazy in the Java interpreter happens. I'm just going to go ahead and say error there because our numbers should either only be 0 or 1. Now you'll notice again from my previous errors that I made the mistake of not incrementing by 1. So I'm just going to say count is equal to count plus 1 at the bottom here. And what I would also like to do is just make a neat little print statement up here at the top that says the current number is, and this is something that I would like to show folks as well as how the print lines can work out to make some cool console looks. If I go ahead and put a colon inside of my string here, that's going to be printed out each time. And what I can actually do is use this plus operator. In some languages, it's called concatenation. You might have heard that in Python. We're going to concat to this string or add on to the string the variable of count. Now, the really neat thing about this is that I don't need to make any conversions of the types or anything. This should go ahead and run for us. So I'm going to go ahead and hit play here. And let's just see if we're right here. So I get the current number is 0, and then I get the number is even. The current number is 1, the number is odd. The current number is 2, the number is even, and so forth. You might have noticed that there's no space between there. I'm a little bit picky in that, so I'm just going to put a space in my string here, and we can see now I have a space there. But you'll see it's a pretty straightforward program, right? And if I actually want to go up to 20 itself, I can put a less than or equal to, or set it to less than 21, and it will put me up there. Now, I want to also talk a bit about functions and return types that are associated with them that can be used by our main method. So again, our main method so far has been kind of doing all the heavy lifting for us, but when we're making programs and so forth, you don't want the main method to be God tier method, right? You want to make sure that work is delegated throughout your program. Now, I want to kind of show off the, with Python, with Python, we were pretty spoiled because we can go ahead and just create a method and have any return type that we would like on it. We can be very lenient with how we make these methods. In Java, that's not the case. The format of a Java file is always going to be the format of our Java method. The format of our Java methods will always be public, static, return type, function name. And we can actually see this laid out here. I could say public static, and let's just say that I want a method that returns adding 1 to a number. So I want to return the type of an int. If I want a method to return a type of int, I need to type int right here. And if I want to say the name of the method, I'm going to say the name right here, add 1. Now, what goes inside of these lists right here? Well, what goes inside of that list is actually the parameters that I'm going to be taking in. So what I want to take in here is an integer that I want to add 1 to. So I'm going to take in an int, and let's just call this parameter name. This could be anything that you would like. It could be gibberish. It could be gibberish. It could just be x. It could be any number that you would like. I'm going to say int x. And what I would like to do is say x is equal to x plus 1. And what I'm going to do now, and this is why Java is a bit helpful too, we'll see here if I hover over this red arrow, it says this method must return a result of type int. And what I could do here is I can actually go ahead and just add a return statement, and it will actually automatically put that in there. But for our purposes here, I'm just going to type out the word return x. Now, you'll see here, this is why Java or Eclipse is very helpful. Does everyone see how my return x is highlighted in gray and so is my int? That is because that is what the return type should be. What if I make this a void? Uh-oh, I'm getting a new error. What's happening now? Void methods cannot return a value. So if you want a method that does something, maybe it prints out something, but it doesn't do anything else, then that should be an int. Now, again, this can work with anything that you would like so. Your method could be a Boolean, it could be a car, or a char, depending on how you pronounce it. It could be a string, and it could be a double. So you can get very creative with your methods and so forth as well. Now let's just actually see how we can actually call this method. So what I would like to do is I want to go ahead and declare a number variable, num. I'm going to set it equal to 5. And I'm just going to go ahead and print out my num. Now, if I hit play here, I get my 5, and we'll notice that this public static method down here is going to return something for me to use. So what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to say I want to kind of assign it to a variable here. So I'm going to say is num, which I already declared up there, is going to be equal to the add 1 of num itself. So num was already declared up here. And this is where it can get a little convoluted with the num being added on. But what should this be? Well, what should happen here is that it's going to say 5 is equal to add 1 of 5. Now, what does this function do? Well, it's going to go ahead and take in an integer. We're going to assign that a variable of x. And what's going to happen next is I'm going to say x is equal to x plus 1. So what's actually happening here is that I have my int of x, which is 5, and then I say 5 is equal to 5 plus 1, which is 6, and I should return that x, which is going to be assigned to this num, and then I'm going to print out that variable, so I'm going to hit play, and now I get 6. And I can keep doing this process here to increase my number by 1. Excuse me. Now you can see here that this is just one way that we can declare a function, and as we declare, a method, and as we declare more and more, they might get more complex. But again, just remember that the layout of each method you're going to make is public static method return type, method name, and parameter list. Now, does every parameter need to have, does every method need to have a parameter list? Absolutely not. So I can make one that says test, and all this prints out something like this. And what can I do with this one? Well, why don't I hop into my main method one more time and let me run this 3 times. Oops. Say I planned that. We could see that it runs 3 times up there because I called it. And we could see I have a void and no return statement. So these are a few ways that we can go ahead and build up our different items here as well. I'm actually going to go ahead and recreate it on my end here. And I forgot to hit that check mark, but I have this memorized. So I'm just going to go ahead and add in my my main method here inside of here. And what I would like to do based on the notes up here, and I'll bring them down for us to bring up here, is we are going to go ahead and create a main method that simulates the repeated rolls of a 6-sided die a certain amount of times. So the main method will call a function called the roll die that returns the roll of a 6-sided die. Now, again, I created a die roll.java file, and you could go ahead and follow along with me while we're doing this too. What I would like to do, let's see here, is go ahead and get started with our die roll method. So let's see. Let me go ahead and create my method die roll, and it's going to return the roll of a 6-sided die. So for our purposes here, I probably don't want this to be a double because I wouldn't want to play a dice game where I get a 0.5 roll. So what I'm going to try to do is go ahead and make this return an integer because I want it to be either 1 to 6, and I'm going to call this die roll. Now you'll notice here that even though I have a return type, I don't really need a parameter either. In my example previously, I did add in a parameter, but just know that it's not required for what we're doing here. What I'm going to do next is go ahead and kind of do a little shortcut. I'm going to go ahead and try to go back to where we had our previous die rolled items here. And I'm going to grab up the formula that we used. And for the time being, I'm just going to type in return 0 to help with that error, but I don't want to return 0 just yet. So what I'm going to try to do here is I'm going to make an integer called roll dice, or I'm going to call it dice roll. That probably sounds a bit better. And I'm going to go ahead and grab up my formula here that I used that we discussed earlier of how we can actually determine how to roll the dice or not. And that's going to be saved to that variable. Now, since that variable is going to be saved there, I'm going to go ahead and actually return that dice roll like so. And now we can see here that I have this working for me. So now, just to go ahead and test this out here, I'm going to go ahead and print out my die roll. And you'll notice that I forgot the two parentheses to make the method call. And if I play this here, I get a 6, I get a 4, I get a 3, 4, 4, 2, cool. Now, what I would like this method to do is to simulate repeated rolls of the dice. So this is a really interesting way for us to start our program up here. We can essentially say, hey, how many times do I want this die to roll? So maybe I can make a new variable, maybe a count variable, and let's just say that I want someone to roll the dice 10 times. Now, this is nice because the code that I'm going to make, as long as I change this variable here, I could change how many times that I roll the dice. Now, we usually did the while loop where we have it only checking the variable, but to be similar to what we saw in the program file examples and to just showcase some more variables in Java, I'm actually going to make a variable called isDone and set it to false. And what I would like my while loop to do is to only be running, oh, excuse me, what I would What I would like to try to do is use some booleans in our problem as well. So I'm going to go ahead and say that there's a boolean variable called isDone, and I'm going to set it to false. Essentially what this variable will be doing for us is it's going to say, hey, whenever whenever I'm not isDone, I'm going to keep running my program. So what I could say here is while not isDone, so essentially while not isDone, cool. So what I would like to try to do is to try to make a while loop to make sure that this runs each time there. So what we can try to do now is I'm going to say while is done. Let's just see if I can get something to print out. And again, when you're making your programs on your end, this is a great way to start checking them out to see if there's any errors. And we'll notice here that I didn't even enter into my while loop here. I didn't get an infinite one. And this is because if I say while is done, I am asking to see if is done is true or not. So essentially I'm checking while is done is true. Is done is not true though. We set it to false. Because we set this to false, we want to try to check, okay, well, how do I get the opposite of true? Well, we remembered a bit ago that the opposite of true is actually found by doing an exclamation point. So if I say while not is done, or while is done is false, I can go ahead and print out my test. So now we can see that this is testing, and I don't want to break my computer there. So now we can see that while is not is done, I'm going to keep going here. So what I would like to do next is to try to make my program stop the while loop first. And the way that I can do this is to try to implement this count variable. And this count variable that we're looking at here is supposed to track how many times that we are supposed to roll our dice. But we'll notice that we don't also have a way to check the current one that we're on. So what I'm going to go ahead and do here is go ahead and say current count. And I'm just going to set that to 0. And maybe I'll call this max count so that we can differentiate. So the max amount of counts that I have is at 10, and the current count I have is at 0. So what I can do next here is say if my current count is greater than my max count, I want to break out of this for loop. Well, what did we say earlier when we figured out that it skipped our... We said earlier that we are going to break out of our while loop once is done is no longer false, right? So what I can do in here is actually go ahead and set is done to be true. And again, the issue here is that I'm not incrementing my current count. So I'm going to go ahead and say my current count is equal to current count plus 1. So now I'm going to go ahead and run this guy and we should get a certain amount of counts. Let me just make this 5 so it's easier to see on our end. And we can see we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 current counts. So we want to make sure that we don't go over it because I just want to do 5. So let's just say I'll make this less than. Oh. Great, so if we run our code here, we might notice that we got 6, so I don't want to do 6 in total, so I'm just going to make this an equal to. And I'm going to go ahead and run this one more time. And cool, we should get 5 this time. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we're getting our 5 tests. So now we kind of have this logic built up of our code where we say, okay, the user can type in 5 up here, and the code is going to loop 5 times, and I'm going to break out of it after 5 times. Now, again, we haven't done anything with the die roll just yet, and I kind of wanted to show everyone this process because, again, you want to make sure that you're building your code up in incremental steps. Again, this is just a completely separate problem where we're looking at how many times our loop should run, but it is important for our program to use it. Now, after we went ahead and did this part, I think we can start working with this die roll function. So first of all, let's try to make sure that we can see this die roll function in action. And I think the way that we can do that is by making a new variable inside of our while loop and saying, hey, int dice, let's just say roll the dice is going to be equal to die roll. That's a bit, it's a pretty long name, but it's fine for our purposes. And what I'm going to say down here is print line, not the, oh, and this is one issue. If you see here, I have roll the dice in a string. If I actually run that, it will print that out and not the variable name. So just make sure you're referencing the actual variable name. There we go. And to make this less confusing, I have an extra one down here. So let me run this one more time. And it looks like I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different dice rolls that happen. This is awesome. So what I can do now is try to make this look a bit more like the example that we saw up here. We are rolling a 6-sided die 10 times. And then we got a few strings here. So what I'm going to do here is try to mimic that. The die roll is like so. Let's just see if I run this, if that looks pretty similar to what we have in our example notes. And it looks like that, right? I have a colon in there, but it's not a big deal. We see here I get this die roll is 5, this die roll is 5, and so forth. We just need to up our ante to be at 6 rolls instead of 5. And that should be 6 right there. And what I also need to do is make sure that we have this kind of opening statement. So I'm going to kind of do a little shortcut here. Let me just grab up this code here, or a string. And I'm going to go ahead, and before we even jump into our while loop, I'm going to go ahead and print out a message that just lets the user know what we are actually doing. We are rolling a 6-sided die 10 times. So now we can see here, though, that I might not want to use this right away, because what happens if I want to roll, let's see here. What happens if I want to roll it not 10 times, but what happens if I roll it 6 times or 25 times? Well, notice that the 10 times doesn't go away for us, right? So what we need to do is actually, instead of just saying 10 times, what I'm going to show everyone is this little trick with concatenation. If you go ahead and end your string, we can see that this is blue, and we can use concatenation or the plus sign. And what I can actually add in here is the variable max count, and I can concatenate that in between these two pieces of strings right here. And we'll see now that we are rolling a 6-sided die 25 times, or we are rolling a 6-sided die 30 times. So cool. Now it's a little bit more involved if we want to change the die as well, but I can show everyone that. But again, if you're not doing, if you're not cool. So when we get more advanced, we can probably also try to change the way that we're rolling the die as well by adding in some more variables and a parameter. But for the time being, this is a really neat way of showing different types of variables that are declared, how while and if statements work, how conditional works, and how the negation works as well. So we covered a lot in this first week. Please make sure you take advantage of either the Monday hours or the Friday hours or any time during the email to help out with it. I will also be posting a discussion board for the lecture material and for the homework assignment for students to help discuss items, and I'll be monitoring that as well. Awesome, everyone. I hope this first week is a great one. And again, please reach out if you have any questions.